are going to get started. My name is Daniela Bleichmar. I am the director of the Levan Institute for the Humanities at USC. I do encourage everyone who is present to turn on their camera if they are able to. It is much nicer for the audience and for all of us to see humans when possible rather than names. Today we will be talking about this brand new book. I don't know how to do this. Emerging from the fogs of the blur background, Lisa Bitel's Otherworld, 9 Tales of Wonder and Romance from Medieval Ireland, out from Oxford University Press in 2024. Lisa will be joined in conversation by Eric Falci from UC Berkeley and Siobhán McElduff from the University of British Columbia. And our partners for today's programs are the Hunnick History Department and the School of Religion at USC. Our program today will be that Lisa will start by introducing the book to us, and then Eric and Siobhán will engage her in conversation about it for roughly 35 to 40 minutes, and then we will reserve the last 15 minutes of the hour for questions from the audience, and I will let you know when we are ready for your questions and ask you to raise your Zoom hand so that you can pose them yourself to the author. Lisa, many congratulations on your new book, and please tell us about it.
Well, I never know what to say about these things, but I got the idea for the book from my husband, because we were in Oxford for most of a year and I was between books and I was so bored. And he said, why don't you do some translations? And to someone who is not Irish, to do a book of translations from Old Irish is, like violating a peace accord or something. It's I was once told by a professor of Irish in Dublin that Americans could never learn the language, and that after 10 years of trying to learn it, I might be able to read some texts. So I decided, hey, I'm an old lady. I'm going to retire soon. I might as well give it a shot. And I just pulled some of my favorites. A lot of these, as I say in the intro, they've all been translated before, one most recently in a dissertation. But, the translations are dull at best and precise, I guess, at best. So I thought, it's a horrible language to learn, a beautiful language to hear, but a horrible one to learn. Nobody reads these things. They're not going to read the translations, which are tucked away in old journals or textbooky sorts of books. So I thought, I'll give it a shot and I'll try to retell them. And I'll try to retell them in a way that helps people grasp the historical context so that they might know some of the things that a person would have known and seen and felt when the stories were written down in the early Middle Ages. I mean, we have no clue when precisely they were written, but roughly in the language of the early Middle Ages. So things like, people didn't know, like, what did houses look like, or when they got together and somebody was telling a tale, well, where did that take place? And what were people wearing? Were they drinking themselves blind while they were listening to these tales? Or what was going on, How did they come to be from told to written? That kind of stuff. So I tried to incorporate some of that contextual stuff, and then also social relationships, the position of women in Ireland, the gender inequalities that went on, the assumptions behind things like love and marriage and lust and kinship and stuff like that. And then finally, I tried to work in the diverse opinions and feelings about religion that come through the texts. In the old days of criticism of these stories, say a century ago or more, when nationalism was the fad, there was a great consensus among scholars, most of them, that these tales are relics of a pagan past. They're set in the Iron Age, before Christianity came to Ireland. But, that nowadays people think that's pretty much nonsense, that these tales are a retrospective of the life in a heroic society that wasn't Christian in the distant past of Ireland. So men in medieval communities, monasteries, Christian communities, were writing these tales as a kind of legendary history, but not a dry kind of legendary history, a history full of like murder and sex and battle and fun sometimes, and tragedy sometimes, and people from another reality, the other world, and not a Christian other reality, just an alternative reality that was in every way pretty much better than real reality for the people who heard and wrote these stories. So they're about the doings of heroes and the people shifting shape and people falling in love despite being married to two other spouses or something like that. And um, they whether they provided an escape for people listening to these tales or whether people really invested in them because they mentioned local places or whether they were just for fun. None of us knows for sure. But they were fun for me to translate. Well, maybe not so much fun translating, but retelling they were fun. And I'm pleased that Oxford has made the pitch it has for this book. That's all I got for you.
Thank you. Eric, would you please start us off?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. Lisa, thank you for this book. It was a total pleasure
Oh,
to
good.
read. Some stories, some of the tales like Toynbee I knew well. Others I didn't know so well. Um, you know, I could attest the difficulty of translating and working on these stories in the Old Irish is very real. I guess my question was, it's such a big. There's so much material, right? The four cycles. There's so much material. Um, so maybe a two-part question. How did you choose which nine you wanted to include in the book? And what was your kind of thinking about the ordering? Because, there are nine separate tales that are interlinked in different ways. But it was also really fun to read. It was also really fun to read it as an arc of sorts.
An album.
Yeah, as an album of sorts. I was just curious
Yeah.
what your thoughts are.
Thanks. Nobody's asked me about the order of the tales. I like that question because I thought about it a lot. Um, so I chose the nine, well, because they all had to do with a person in our world and a person in the she, the other world, hooking up one way or another, for better or worse. And I chose some because they were my favorites, like the wooing of Aideen, absolutely my favorite tale of all the many Irish tales out there from the period. Um, but I chose some because they weren't very well known, like the story of Bekwala, and I chose some because they fit the other tales. But what I wanted to do was start with the oldest tale, um the Adventure of Conla. If you folks have read the book, the first one's very short and it's about this prince, historical, supposedly prince, who's wooed by a woman from the other world who comes to him every night and basically enchants him. And his father and his father's druid are very upset about this. They don't want him running off with this mystery woman, but eventually he does. They climb in a crystal boat and sail off to the west. And that tale, the oldest we know of, probably 7th century, um, is supposedly a Christian allegory as well. So from the start, we're not sure what the religious impulse is behind some of these tales, right? So I wanted to start with that one, the oldest one. And then I wanted to show, with the wooing of Aideen, a more complex version of love across the worlds. I mean, every time I read that text, I get more confused about what's going on in it. And then I wanted to show some variation, like in the wooing of Beckala, it's a tale that changes genre about 6 times. And I had to throw in some tragedy. And so when the King of Norway's daughter comes down to visit the hero Cuchulainn, things go badly. I thought that was an important one to put in. Um, and then, of course, I couldn't avoid the great hero Cuchulainn, who has many amorous adventures. Folks who don't know, the big epic of early Irish literature, the Toynbee Cuchulainn, is a story of a cattle raid, essentially, that involves all the Irish warriors from all the provinces. And, you couldn't pay me enough money to go near that and try to translate it because many people have done so well. But the hero of that tale turns up in all sorts of others, and you could be reading some story about something completely different, and some reference to Holland will show up. So I chose them for their interactions, for the different kinds of tales of interaction with the other world, and because some of them are just really funny or cool or romantic. There's so many out there, though.
Yeah, no, I thought it was a great selection. I loved the selection, and it was such a pleasure to read them as an arc, as a kind of curated arc.
I'm glad you felt that. Yeah.
And so I was wondering kind of what that must have been kind of fun to put together those
Absolutely.
9 in that order.
Yeah, although if you ask my husband, you'll know I complained every minute of writing this book.
On that note, Siobhán, would you please?
Right. Yes, I also thoroughly enjoyed reading this. I did read it over well, it was lashing rain outside. I did envy them the suspiciously good weather of otherworldly Ireland, which is yes, and yeah. So you can definitely tell you're in the fantasy land there. So I mean, there's so much I could ask you about this, but I'm going to start off with a question just about the framing. And one of the things people complain about also with any oral literature, I know this is written, but when anybody writes it down, or with storytellers, they frame everything. There's always a narrator's voice before you go into the story. And I enjoyed very much your narrator's voice as part of that, which sort of seemed to reintroduce that sort of missing framework. And I'm wondering if that was part of the intent, to think about, because you just mentioned we don't know the context, but to think about more, to give more sense of the context in these being not just text, but texts that are retold in different ways by different people.
Yeah. That came sort of naturally to introducing the tales, but the more I thought about it, the more I wanted to put into those introductions. And it was at about that point of drafting those introductions that the press got back to me and said, we can't call these translations.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
Coming up, but I'll wait till after Eric's next question.
No, it's great because I was reading the report from one reader, and I could see they started out a little puzzled. Wait, that's not in the original text. And then they got a little head up. Wait a minute. She put that in. That's her words. And then it was, oh, I see what she's doing. And she has some good jokes in there, and the intros help. So yeah, I wanted to not just to put myself in the text, but to make sure people knew I was going into the text, that I was in there. And so the intros were sort of for that. And then I thought, I've never been a storyteller, but this is a lot of fun. So I'm thinking, I should write some more stories.
Yeah, maybe a related question. Yeah, that seems like one of the really kind of, I don't know if risky is the right word, but yeah, I mean, of course, when you send this to readers at OUP, and it's going to be folks in council, they're saying, well, that's not what, how did you, and what was it really interesting is that your insertions or asides or kind of remarks are quite occasional, right? Just every couple of pages or so, there'll be kind of, a sentence, sometimes its own little paragraph set apart, sometimes kind of a sentence kind of tucked into what seems like more straightforward translation. And I'm assuming, I was thinking oh, it must have been really interesting and hard to decide, when and how to license yourself to involve yourself in the act of translation. Did you have a sense of, was it just kind of a feel intuition thing, or did you, or did you just...
Yeah, it was when you write an article or give a critical paper on a tale or a couple of tales, a poem, and the format is you tell what's in the contents, and then you begin to level your criticisms, right? And I felt like I was going through the text with students maybe and said, look at what she did there. This is what it means. But you're right. It felt risky. I've been trained for years and years by those evil professors in Dublin, to separate myself, as I'm sure you guys have, from the text. And I thought actually, Siobhán, you were kind of an inspiration for some of this, because I knew you were working on reception of classics in Ireland, early modern Ireland, and I was thinking, well, you know, how would they have received Virgil? And then I was thinking back, how did people receive these tales in the early Middle Ages? What were they thinking? You know, was anybody feeling sorry for Aideen when she got turned into a big purple fly, you know, without saying anything? So I figured, well, once I was in there with one line, you know, to explain things, I might as well jump in. And I just sort of tried not to say too much, you know.
Yeah, I mean, this is the sort of your point about professors in Dublin. I have to admit, like, there definitely is Irish studies is very much a field where they pull few punches,
Yeah.
and yes. So I feel like we could talk about like sort of like the sort of that side of it, and maybe we'll be later. But actually, I have a question for you as a translator and from a fellow translator. And this is just a basic question, because I mean, there's obviously so many places where you're making decisions whenever you do anything. None of this maps right on. So I was sort of interested to find out, what was your biggest battle, either with the publisher or with yourself? And it could be like a phrase or something you wanted to say, or for example, even just a single word. Like I vividly remember my biggest battle from when I did a translation. So I just
Yeah.
practice in your head. And I'm very interested to hear about like how you went about that, because this is a retelling, but it's also a translation, and
Yeah.
in a field in which, you know, these are not the most stable of texts. So anyway, so yeah.
Yeah, if you mean, you know, there are variants and there are things that people with far more sure grasp of Old Irish than I have struggled with. And that actually is where the storytelling part came in handy, because I could always say it's not a mistranslation, it's a choice. Um, but I had the worst trouble with the place names, you know, and folks who don't know, the early Irish writers were mad about place names. They would stop in the middle of any kind of scene to tell you why a place was named a thing and what its other name used to be and why that was, and that kind of stuff. And in the story of the hero Cuchulainn wooing his future wife, the two court by having a sort of riddle game over place names, and the way Cuchulainn had got to her house, and he uses metaphors and she has to figure them out, and this is like, you know, verbal foreplay. And I just like, with that and the description of horses, I just wanted to say, we all know everyone slept through these passages, right? When the storyteller was standing up there, there was probably one guy from that ford named after a certain person who was paying attention, and everybody else was just waiting for the action, you know. So the hardest part then was trying to do that poetry in any way that mattered to readers. And you might have noticed at one point I just got fed up and said, that horse is a lot like the other horse. You know, the adjectives are much the same. I just can't keep saying them. Um, so, you know, and on the Celtic, the professors of Irish and Celtic and so forth, I've yet to read a review from any of them. When one comes out, I'm just going to go hide in the closet and let Peter tell me what it says.
So,
Eric, I don't know if you were trying to ask a question.
yeah,
We
sorry, I
couldn't hear.
started
Yeah,
I
sorry.
started to ask a question, then thought of a different question, and then went fully silent. I guess so. What you know, one of the things that's interesting about, yeah, I mean, it kind of comes off to what you were just saying. Like, one of the things I really liked about the translation is some of these prose texts, you know, they do get, in a way, at least to like reading them in the small blue books, the kind of, they really lean on repetition. Like, there's so much repetition, you know, as part of an oral. You know, like the constant tag, like someone asks a question and, you know, it's not difficult to say, right? And then they say, and it's always the same thing. And I thought you handled that, like I felt like the text kind of kept moving in really interesting ways. In the same way, at the same time that you didn't really you didn't really like leave off. Like, I loved the description of the houses and Fidkiel and all, you know, all the kind of stuff that they did. And I guess this may be a version of a question that has been asked before. Like, did you did you give yourself lots of, I mean, I didn't have time to go back and compare your versions to, you know, the actual text
Good.
on the translation. Like, did you give yourself, you know, all the license you wanted to sort of, you know, in the long adjectival runs that we'd see here and there, did you let yourself be a storyteller in those
Sometimes.
moments, or do you say, okay, well, I gotta do the
Yeah, you know,
thing?
the poetry was a challenge. I mentioned in the intro, for those who don't know, Irish poetry in that period is really complex, and it has to do with like counting syllables and emphases on syllables, sort of like Latin, but then also it had different kinds of rhyming and alliteration and stuff, and all these really evil, devious meters. Um, so I really started out wanting to try to write the poetry poetically, because in translation classes in grad school, that's the stuff that suffers the most, you know, at the hands of students. I mean, they're flipping through the old Irish dictionary trying to find exact equivalents, and it never sounds like poetry when it comes out, you know. So, and I noticed in one of the poems, I'd never noticed this till I sat down and translated it again with, you know, they describe horses and you can hear the pounding of the hooves coming closer and closer and closer and stuff like that. So I really wanted to include that, and that's one of those magic feats of translation that's almost impossible to carry off, you know. That's why when you run across a good translation of something like, you know, the Iliad, you think, oh my God, I wish I could do that. Because the sound of the tale and the feeling of the tale is hard. So sometimes, yeah, I sacrificed a few adjectival forms, you know, in order to get something poetic. But I really did try to include everything in the spirit in which it was written in the first place, which is not to say, I mean, it's sort, as you know, and maybe others don't, but these stories are sometimes composites. And so it's hard to say I strove for the author's voice, but I kind of did.
Siobhán, did you want to come in?
Yeah, like in speaking, like this is actually, it comes up to a question of like, again, I guess it goes back to, though I have realized this is one of the bits. Actually, I wanted to ask you specifically, this, so it's from the Toynbee Froth, and it's one of these lines where you're describing a place, uh, as a gloomy, terrible land with belligerent warriors. They dash all over the place, snatching cattle and kidnapping women and stealing treasures. And obviously, it's about a specific place and a specific group of people they don't like. We won't necessarily go into that, but I was wondering if you thought about that as a good sort of summary for the collection as a whole. Because when I was looking, I noticed it says 9 tales of wonder and romance. You start with like it's I think you don't call them romance, you call them love, like which is a very different connotation, and miracles. So like this is much softer on the outside than the inside. Like, so I mean, yeah, so there's an enormous amount of raiding. I mean, there is love, but there's an enormous amount of theft going on and sort of raping and stuff like this. And I'm just wondering, like, you know, in terms of the sort of subtitle, if you did actually struggle over that, you know, the sort of like, yes, or how do you suggest that as part of romance? I mean, obviously as a classicist, it's pretty common part of romance, but yeah, getting that into the narrative and explaining that connection is very
yeah, I know it's hard, right? I mean, what do you call, they're certainly not about love. A lot of them are about passion or lust. And some of them are just about like stealing women, right? Or at least that happens at the same time. For example, there's a variant on the wooing of Aideen where Mither picks up Aideen to fly away, and he just picks up her handmaiden too, and they all three of them fly off together, and you know what was happening with that. So yeah, it's hard. And you know, I always try to explain to my students that in the early Middle Ages, love had nothing to do with marriage and procreation. It was a contract, and there are all these stories about people then finding passion outside of marriage and all these laws against it. So you know it was going on all the time. But you know what to call this when two characters really did have a passion for each other, like Cuchulainn with you know, this woman from the other world that he gets together with in the last tale, in the sickness of Cuchulainn. You know, what to call that people obviously expected there to be, well, there to be like instances when people fell in love and it turned out poorly. I should think that happened a lot, you know. So I don't know what word you would use. I mean, romance is obviously a word used by later medieval writers too, and so that was homage to the fairy tale to call it romance as well. I don't know, what would you have called it? We need a new word.
I mean, I guess there's probably no good translation. This is where you always fall back on the translator's answer. It's just like I find it sort of. I mean, obviously, like when books come out, you don't always have control over what goes on them. I find it very careful that you just avoid in your introduction talking about romance. You're like, yes, you're very clear. This is passion and love. Whereas,
Yeah.
quite clearly, I mean, obviously, like there is a theme. I mean, whatever you're describing it, it's more than. I mean, some of the stories are clearly about desire, but they're about more. But I don't know what you call these. I don't even know like what tales, like even
Attraction.
yeah.
I don't know. I mean, you read these stories and you know in the back of your mind, in fact, there was a good monograph about this. If you have power, you can have sex with anything that doesn't have power, and by and large, war was killing of men and mass raping of women and burning down houses, which they indulged in all the time. So, how you talk about attraction between two people of different sexes and different so-called races, worlds, in any meaningful way is beyond me, except the universal, right? Romance.
And maybe to turn that question just a different dimension, I mean, I'm not I remember when I first started reading these tales and trying, translate them. What was often sort of remarkable was just, some, grad student read, used to reading, I don't know, Wolf or whatever, like the total lack of kind of psychological motivation in the stories,
Yeah.
like just stuff just happens,
Yeah.
right? Like, and it gets, and Cuchulainn especially just does things and you're like, what in the world, right? And I know, I mean, this has been such a part of the bringing these stories into, in the 19th century, like they had to be kind of what was made acceptable, right? Because, I mean, Cuchulainn, I mean, I think you did a great job. The warp spasm, the way you describe the kind of Cuchullainn's warp spasm, I was looking for the page and I couldn't find it, but it's really wonderful because that's just so strange. Like the hero, like the non-Homeric, the idea of a Homeric hero with one eye jutting out and the other one going in and having seven fingers, all this stuff, it's just kind of not really heroic. And so I guess, I mean, the question, the question that I really kind of still struggled with, not with the translations, but with the stories, is like how we're understanding these figures as characters, right? Who are doing things and falling in love and having sex and killing other people, but often with that kind of lack of like why they're doing it, or in kind of some psychologically interesting way that I'm like, as a late 20s, someone who reads novels or something, like would always just be expecting. That was one of the hardest things in coming to these tales and trying to figure out what to do with them.
Yeah. I mean, people read Beowulf and it kind of makes sense, right? I mean, you can see he does stuff. But I mean, if folks may not, Cuchulainn, the great hero of Irish literature, when he gets really had up, he turns into sort of a monster. And the descriptions of him with an eye bulging out and one in and like fire shooting up from his head, I mean, they're sort of silly when you read them as a modern. And I think they were supposed to be outrageous then too. I think he was a figure of fun a lot of the time. A lot of these stories now I realize that I take as almost like anime, which when I first started watching it, I couldn't make sense of that either. But it's like these larger than life characters, very bright, very emotional, and they do really weird things, and occasionally they do something that seems human. And I mean, I kind of love that because it's, to not understand what's going on means you are in the modern period and they are in the past, and you found what you got to understand in order to understand how life was, right? So I'm not sure what Cuchulainn has to do with the psychology of early medieval Irish warriors, but I think the element of humor that runs through everything, even really serious stuff, is really crucial. That helped me a lot.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Like, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think in yours, like Cuchulainn is, I've never, he's kind of funny, right? It's kind of goofy in a way.
Yeah, and so is, the Dagda, and maybe not in these tales, but, yeah, they're often Magog. Yeah.
Yeah, the closest I can always think about is like Lucan in Latin poetry, where clearly Lucan means quite a lot of it very seriously, but I've yet to actually get students through it without them finding it absolutely mind-bogglingly hilarious, to the point where like Cato fighting, there's a scene where someone fights snakes, and it's very much that scene. So yeah, so I definitely agree. It's a very hard thing to work out how serious, and it lies on a knife edge of parody.
Yeah.
So I was gonna actually, what if I have time for one more question? And it's actually to go back to your thing about place names.
Mm.
So I know, like, I feel I'm gonna push back. I feel like there is a pleasure, and I wonder, like, I know that perhaps this doesn't come across in text, but Irish people really do like writing about place, like ballads. There are so many ballads that are not just
Yeah.
about a place, but about lovingly describing like every ditch that you stood by as you left it. And obviously those are coming from different impulses necessarily, and that some of that has to do with immigration. But I'm wondering if you want to speculate about the pleasure that in the Middle Ages, beyond the one guy who came from the random place that no one had ever heard of and was really delighted that finally it had popped up in somewhere, if you think about these as ways of people mapping these stories not just in like time but in space and encountering them, because like so much of the Irish landscape is bounded with like fairies or other things, that this is much more perhaps alive. Like I know that it is annoying when you're reading through it, like I have to admit.
No, I mean, I obviously I've thought a lot about that. And what place names have to do with making the past material lively before your eyes. And I don't know if it's cause or effect, but I think a lot of times about people in the early Middle Ages, say the 8th or 9th century, and they're walking down the road and there's this big mound, and the word is that there's some king buried under there, or this is a place where the goddess killed herself because of, or and that mound from like Fergus's cattle are over there, but you also know it from the deep past of that place. And so your history and the history of your community and the history of all the other communities are there in that weird sacral mound. And I think that's got to be a lot to do with it. History was so obvious there all around people. Um, but I don't know if it also had to do with finding your way, uh, metaphorically as well as, literally, across 2 fields and go past the place where Fergus's cattle died because the fairy came and, did this or that to them. Have you thought much about that too?
I guess because like I come from like Tory and then Sligo, which are very much tied in with like Lou and then Maeve and the Toyne. Well,
Yeah.
the big Toyne. We'll talk
Yeah.
about the Toyne.
There
The
she is up on the hill.
the major Toyne, like yeah. But it's stuff like this, and it just like it does seem to be like that. Yes. It's hard to say because I don't think it gets across, and I don't think it gets across because we are obviously more transient than people in these periods, in the sense of we move around in bigger spaces.
Yeah, yeah, and we don't talk our places as much, I mean, hey, Google Maps, and now we're all screwed, right? So
to get started, use the Google.
sorry, my
Maps on
Google
the phone or
thing is
Oh.
talking to me. Sorry, talk about voices from the landscape. But people don't still do that, right? Do they? It's like, oh, Phoenix Park, over there's where my cousin Jerry got shit-faced, and then did this or that terrible thing after the game or something like that.
Oh yeah, God,
Yeah.
no, they do. Trust me, like half of Phoenix Park is like random places where terrible things happened. Generally speaking, there's a lot of deaths, or people got murdered, or other bits, or things
Great.
happened, or so and so. So I feel like, and I do think like it is like, especially in the countryside, like there's a hungry rock near where my brother lives. If you cross it, you will die of hunger. Like you will be hungry for the rest of your life. And like, yes, nobody really believes it, but nobody's keen to cross over that. No one knows quite a specific point. So
I
I
wouldn't
feel
do
on
it.
one level it's true, but you still don't knock down fairy fords.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Although that's another problem in itself, right? It's like the mythology of today and the fairy mythology and so forth. There's such a historical break, I think. I've been working on that recently with the famine or with the confessional strifes. I don't know. Anyways.
So at the very beginning, in your introductory remarks, you kind of framed two topics, kind of questions about gender and sexuality, and then questions of kind of religion. Could you just say a bit more about the second? Just, what, you said that was a dimension of what you were trying to bring to the surface in these tales. Like, what was your what did you make it, like, how are these like alternative, different religious kind of strata operating?
Yeah, I don't think they are.
Mm-hmm.
I've thought about it a lot. I sort of mentioned it at the start of this session. Um, so in these stories, there are people who are Christian, whatever that meant. I'm very much an advocate of there being multi-Christendoms in the past. Although don't get me started on so-called Celtic Christianity. But these people are identifying as Christians because they're writing, right? They're writing down things, and they live in monasteries where people can afford to make books. And my question is not what are they keeping from the past, but like how are they making that past? And when they do that, how are they thinking religion of the past? Because a lot of people think they can come to these tales and draw out a pantheon for the period before Christianity. And sure, there are some echoes, of like Lugh, who was a deity across different territories, Ireland and Gaul and so forth. But there's nothing of religion in here. There are no rituals except druids calling down bad weather, and there are no shrines, and there are no real deities. But obviously, the guys who wrote these tales are aware that they're dealing with a past that isn't Christian. So it's kind of like, people in Frankish kingdoms writing about the Romans, right? They had no clue what Romans were doing for religion, although they had more descriptions than these guys writing about their own past. But I wonder constantly what they could have known about the previous centuries, what was left. And all I can conclude is that it's in the odd family tale and in the landscape. They were just making it up from the landscape. But I don't know. Maybe the traditions. I mean, people talk about the song lines in Australia and how, the people who lived there carried oral tales over thousands of years. There's no way of knowing. But I did want people to realize it's not like storytellers they had some ancient tale that they were just regurgitating onto a page, which is what critics used to think. It's a good question.
We have time maybe for one last question from each of the invited speakers before we open it up for questions from the audience around 12:45.
Is it my turn? I can't work out if I'm jumping in on Eric.
No, it is your turn.
Yeah, go right ahead. Go right
I
ahead.
think I might have lost the bit I was going to ask about, though. It's like you looking for the bit. Yeah. So actually, it's speaking of this. I guess one of the things is just thinking about like the physical descriptions. Obviously the warp spasm gets the most attention. Like I feel like we forget like how much of this text is about describing very beautiful people being very beautiful and murderous. And I'm wondering, sort of, as you were translating it, I mean, we have a great language for, like, I guess, charisma and like beauty in the modern world. I'm wondering if, when you were working on that, if you struggled with that or if you found that easier, because that is, I think, the less focused on bit. Like, people don't write about these people as in their normal shape, but they're more beautiful than they are warp spasmed. So yeah.
Well, the descriptions of beautiful people are pretty stereotypical. And we all know that if you come from the síde, the other world, you're a great looking blonde, by and large. And I think there's far more attention given in these tales to what people are wearing than and to their horses than what they themselves look like, except maybe for Cuchulainn. But they always describe, as women as being very fair skinned, and when they describe their hair as being the color of irises, they mean those yellow ones, and lips like, I don't know, cherries or berries or something. So it's pretty formulaic, and it's the clothing's pretty formulaic too. So it's not like you're being told about an individual. You're being told about someone's status, someone's desirability as well, and someone's wealth, you know. And if a guy comes wearing a green cloak that's embroidered in silver, you know, that's a guy from the She. Watch out for him, you know. Or if all his harpers have, you know, Triskelies on their cloaks, then you know he's from the She, like in that great part of Toyn Befroig. So, and that doesn't stop the writers from using a million adjectives to describe the same old green cloaks with the silver embroidery. But, you know, the beauty is it's like a tool in the stories, I think, more than anything else.
I'm happy to keep asking questions, but Daniela, would it be better to open it up since I know this is
I
10
was
o'clock?
just going to
Okay.
say, I think we are at that time. Sorry to interrupt the conversation. If you would like to ask a question, please raise your Zoom hand and I will call on those who do. Maybe while people formulate their questions, I will start with one, Lisa. And I wanted to ask you about how your expertise as a historian informed your translations. You wear your erudition lightly, both in person, in this conversation, and in the book. But it's clear, to me at least, that there's so many choices that one could make differently, and that you make based on your knowledge, not just of these worlds, but of the history of gender, the history of religion. Maybe I'll just connect it to something that I hope you will appreciate, which is the different between translation and adaptation, as posited by the guy who directed the Spanish language version of The Simpsons for a long time. And so anyone who is familiar with The Simpsons in Spanish knows that they are much funnier than in English because there's layers of humor. And when this team was fired and a new team brought in, it was disastrous. And The Simpsons became unfunny, and there were mutinies from Simpsons fans. And the guy who had been ousted, who had done such an amazing job, said, well, they are translators. They just tell you the English joke in Spanish, and that's not funny. We do an adaptation. We make it funny by making it a Spanish joke, a Mexican joke. So I was just wondering how you as a historian made it funny and made it make sense as an adaptation.
It's the hardest thing. I didn't know that about The Simpsons. That's so great. I knew they had religion in there, but I didn't know that happened. Yeah, no, that's the hardest thing. I think I say the jokes are the hardest part. It took me the longest time to realize that I could laugh at Caholen, that you know, that some of the plots are meant to be parodic, that you know, the things that, as Eric was saying, the things that just happen and you have no idea why. Well, sometimes it's because they're supposed to be funny. And the way I figured that out was I mean, that's what attracted me to this literature in the first place and to the history that went with it. I figured if these guys are making jokes, they must be okay to study. They must be really interesting people. My very first class in Old Irish when I was in college, it was the tale of Macduff's pig. It's this big battle that happens because somebody wants a dog and somebody else wants the same dog, and a pig comes into it. They eat it. But I mistranslated a very ordinary line where it was something about each hero got to go up to the pig and take a slice or something, and I thought it said each man got to go up to the pig and give it a whack on the nose or something like that, you know. And the class burst out laughing, and I thought, well, why is that any more improbable than what they did with the pig, you know? And thinking back to that episode as a grown-up, I realized that, you know, humor runs through almost all these tales and no one ever notices it, like I said before. And so I had to use my historian's voice and my storyteller voice to make the jokes intelligible. I had to change the jokes to make them funny. And, you know, I don't think I brought them out nearly as much as I should have and I could have, but but that was a choice.
They're
That's
funny.
a great question.
Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. If not, Eric, we can go to that question that you were about to pose when we were running out of time for that.
Are there any fairy tale people here? I'd love to hear about if people notice connections with medieval fairy tales or romances. I want to know what happened to the fairies. No?
Eric or Siobhán?
You know what? I just got to say, this is typical when I give papers at medieval academy conferences or at the religious, the Academy of American Religion. No one ever knows Ireland, right? I mean, I'm sure you guys get this too, Siobhán and Eric. So you have to spend so much time explaining what it was that everybody feels afraid of like asking a basic question. Yay!
Ask a
We have a
question.
question.
I'm not gonna I have no shame, so I'm totally gonna keep asking questions. I'm pushing it. Is there somebody else asking one?
Somebody has actually raised their hand.
I want to hear yours.
Maybe, I don't know how to, Lynn, would you like to pose your question? And
So you opened the opportunity to ask a really basic question, and I read a number of these tales. I really enjoyed the way that you framed them and translated them, and I kept stumbling across the prominence of this foster son conceptualization. But why not the regular son, but constantly this much more complex kinship situation? And I wonder if that was just always there, or how that. It's such a big question, I realize, but
yeah, no, it's a great question. Peter my husband kept telling me, you better explain this because people aren't going to get this. It was a system of almost like apprenticeship. It's in the Irish laws of the period. And if you were a person of status, you would send your kid to some other person, maybe of equal or better status, if you could, to learn how to be a noble person, an adult. A woman would go and learn to be, a manager of a household and to do embroidery. And a boy would go learn how to fight and probably manage his clients. But it had another purpose, and that was to supply a kid, especially a man, with allies that weren't related to him by blood, or at least not directly, because inheritance was shared among heirs. Right. So if you were one of a king's many sons and the king got old and was going to die, you needed someone to trust so your brothers didn't off you for the kingship, to put it in its most stark form. And if you were a woman who went out of her territory to marry someone else, you needed someone you could call on to help you out if you got into trouble with your husband's family. And so it just created a sort of safety network for people. And one thing I've never been able to figure out, I don't know if you guys know, Eric and Siobhán, is how low down the social hierarchy the system went. But it was common across Irish and I think Scots society until well into the Middle Ages. It's a great, I don't know where else it happened. I'm sure it happened elsewhere in Europe. I don't know where though. Great
we
question.
have a question from Rebecca M. If you could please unmute yourself.
Hi. Can
hi.
you hear me? Can you hear
Yep.
me? Okay. So yeah, I'm at work. I'm tuning in from from work from actually Durwood, Maryland, USA.
Ooh, thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're very welcome. So basically, I wanted to comment about the fairy tales. So I've read a few of Morgan Daimler's. So I can say she's an American who did master Old Irish. So but what I see in her stories is she I see a lot of correlation with modern problems. Like with hers, as somebody wandering through the forest, they come across a fairy and they spend time with them and they keep going back. And I correlate that with addiction, with drug addiction. And then they make a choice, like, do I want to stay with the fairies or do I want to live on Earth? And I see that repeatedly in those. That's all I wanted to share.
No, that's common in more modern Irish folklore, right? People get glamored and taken away, or seized by the fairies, and a body is put in their place back in the real world, and they can't seem to leave. There's always the danger you'll go into a fairy portal and get stuck there, you know. I never know if that means you shrink down to be a little fella like the rest of them, you know, or whether you keep your own form or what happens. But yeah, it is like drugs or like desire or like anything that draws you out of your proper framework, right? It takes you away. I don't know if we see that so much in the old tales. I mean, there's one about a guy named Nara who goes into the She and he stays, but he stays because he finds a wife there and wants to, it's a better life. But people seem to keep their heads. I don't know. Good question.
James?
Hey, yeah, congrats. And yeah, I'm really pleased that you sort of stuck to your guns about just not doing an unreadable dry translation.
You know about those.
Unreadable translations, and you kind of get in trouble for that. You know, I don't know, you're all in different disciplines, but if you're one of these conservative ancient language disciplines, you get a lot of European people often getting really angry with you. And but yeah, I'm really into this whole incomprehensible joke idea, which is actually really fascinating, in fact. And I'm just curious, like, what was the most baffling joke or thing that probably was a joke that you came across?
Yeah, that's hard because I probably didn't notice. You know what I mean? Yeah, but you know, even just discovering that there was humor in some of these tragic tales was difficult. You know, I mean, if you're working, you know, if you're working with a language that has so many connotations and a word can mean a number of different things, how do you know when you get to laugh? And then I just thought, well, whenever it makes me laugh, it's a joke, you know. Hoping I didn't mistranslate it again, right? About knocking the pig on the snout. But, you know, something like I said, like Cuchulainn, who's the great hero, to realize, wait a minute, he's really weird. And having 6 pupils in your eye and people thinking you're beautiful, that's funny, you know, because you're not beautiful. You look weird. So just stuff like that, you know. I don't know if you have narrative texts like this that you deal with that maybe have jokes tucked into them, but, you know.
Yeah, thank you.
Julie?
Hello.
Hello.
I'm Julie van Tongelo. I'm here from Belgium, and I learned about this book talk through Laura O'Brien from the Irish Pagan School.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I'm coming at this in terms of Irish paganism, and also within the Irish pagan school, we are encouraged to read a lot of the lore, to really dive into it, and also to then apply it to our daily lives. As myself, I am a practicing pagan. I practice Irish paganism. So for me, these gods are real. For me, it's I understand it's a very different concept, but I thought it was interesting to bring in. And so we've really dived into the Tambal Cunha, and also, for instance, one of the big ones, the
Julie, I am sorry, but real quickly, Julie, could you post your question, please? We have 2 minutes before the book chat is over.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I will post my question. I apologize. I apologize.
Oh, no. I wonder if you were thinking of Lever Gavala or else the second battle of Moytura. Those are the most mythological tales,
yeah.
right?
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking about that. And also I was just curious about I was curious about what you would think in terms of Cuchulainn not necessarily being the hero, but being an anti-hero.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good one. I think lots of people think he's the disruptor, right? He's the guy that causes all the trouble. And when everybody else is laid low in the Táin, he's the one that can keep fighting, you know, and keep the war going. And he is a kind of tricky figure, isn't he? But I don't think he's bright enough to be anything but a pain in the ass, actually. I don't think he's a traditional trickster so much as just an aggressive man. Who does cause trouble, as you say, yeah. The Hound of Cullen. Thanks. And I did not mean by any means to denigrate any kind of religion that people make from Irish mythology. Good on you.
We are unfortunately at the end of our time. Thank you so much to Siobhán McElduff and Eric Falci for accepting our invitation to talk with Lisa about her book. Thank you all for joining us, and above all, thank you, Lisa, for your book and the wonderful tales you have shared with us about it and in it. Many congratulations.
Thank you. And if everyone here buys a copy, then I'll make like $10. So go for it.